True and tragic stories, first on BBC1. Often called the hidden victims of crime, relatives of those who killed describe in detail their pain and suffering.
Every day in this country, people kill. Some kill in a rage, others for pleasure. And always they leave a trail of grief behind them. But the agony is not confined to the victims' relatives. Families of those who kill are devastated too.
I was so hurt that my son had done all these things to people, and I couldn't make it right.
If he committed one of those murders, he deserved to be hanged.
I've got to be there for him. I've got to show him I'm there for him, and I've got to show the world I'm there for him somehow.
These are families who have been spared the absolute horror of losing a loved one to violence. They carry a hidden burden, the knowledge that one of their own has killed.
One of the things I remember about my mother's funeral, one of the things which was so completely outrageous, was the fact that my father sent her flowers.
In 1986, former professional footballer Tom Sanders killed his 36-year-old wife Susan. Every year in the United Kingdom, an average of 150 people are killed by their current or former partners.
Killers are very different in terms of their genetic disposition, in terms of their family background, and in terms of their particular circumstances. We cannot generalize and say all murderers have certain things in common. They don't.
Gail Sanders is 24 and a student. She was the youngest child in her family and grew up in the port of Folkestone with her mother and father.
To people outside of our house, he was probably quite charming, very believable, probably quite likeable. I really don't know why he behaved the way he did towards us in the house. I really don't know. There didn't seem to be any escaping him, so it was constantly on my mind. When was he going to hurt me? How was he going to hurt me? What was he going to do to my mum? How was she going to be? What could I do? When we went to church, we didn't go as a family. And they would sit in the church on opposite sides.
Gail's parents were divorced in 1985. Their battle for custody of their youngest daughter ended in the High Court in London on the 10th of November 1986. Gail was at a friend's house when her mother phoned with the good news that she had won.
I felt a combination of complete terror at the thought of what's he going to do? What's he going to do? Because he's lost this battle, he's going to do something. That was my initial feeling. And then I felt, but thank goodness it's my mum that's going to look after me. And she came to the house and she really was smiling, something which she didn't really do very often. And she came in and she she gave my friend and I a packet of Rolos, and I was really, really pleased with these Rolos that I had. And my friend's father offered to drive us home. When we got back to the house, we saw that there were no lights on, and we both looked at each other. I said, "Ooh, thank goodness he's not there. We can go in." We knew that he wasn't there. There was no need for us to be afraid. My mum put the key in the door, and he opened the door to us. He had been there waiting for us with this big grin on his face. And he grabbed hold of one of my arms, and my mum grabbed hold of the other arm, and I felt like I was being split in two. I could feel the intensity of the pain. He managed to pull us in. He was waiting there, and there was no argument. He started the violence straight away. And my mum called to me 3 times, "Gail, please phone the police." And then her last words, as she screeched, she absolutely screeched, "You murderer." And they were her very, very last words. I've never in my life heard someone screech with such agony and pain. I was sure I was going to die as well. And although I witnessed the whole ordeal, at the very end, when she was hanging from the banisters, I managed to run out of the house, and I ran as fast as I could back to my friend's house. And I was so terrified, I knew he was going to come after me, so I ran as quickly as I could. And throughout everything, I still had these Rolos in my hand. I hadn't even eaten one yet. And as I was running, I dropped these Rolos. My head was turned back, and I wanted to stop to pick them up. My legs wouldn't let me. My legs kept going, my legs wouldn't stop. And I so desperately wanted these Rolos.
Gail's friend's mother found it difficult to believe the panic-stricken little girl on her doorstep.
My friend's mum, she answered the door, and I said to her immediately, "My dad's killed my mum." And she said to me, "Oh, come inside. I'm sure they've just had an argument and she's probably fainted." And suddenly in my head I thought, I'm wrong.
But it was her friend's mother who was wrong. Gail's father had killed his own wife, and Gail had witnessed the entire event. She was just 12 years old.
One of the most traumatic experiences a child can endure is to watch his or her parent being murdered. To experience that and try to make sense of it is impossible. The suffering that's likely to occur is very, very great and long-lasting.
I was in absolute shock. I was in so much shock. There were no feelings, there were no what's going to happen now, what has happened. My existence centred around just eating and breathing, really.
Gail's father was remanded to Canterbury Prison, pleading manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility.
3 or 4 months after the event, I went to Canterbury Prison to see my father. We went into this room, and I just remember there being one tiny window really high up, and he came through the door. And it was horrifying. I had to completely cut myself off, and I was so frozen in order to cope with the situation. I don't really know why I went to see him. But I never went back to the prison again to see him. I refused.
With her father in prison, Gail spent the next few months in foster homes. Then she was transferred to the adolescent unit of a psychiatric hospital near Folkestone, since closed. She stayed there for over a year.
I thought, I'm being sentenced. I am being put in a prison because the windows only opened so far, this far, and you couldn't put your head through them, and because the doors were often locked. I thought, my goodness, they think it's my fault too, and they're giving me a prison sentence. In fact, I was in this place longer than my father was in prison.
Tom Sanders' plea of manslaughter was accepted. He was sentenced to 3 years and served a total of 11 months. When he was released, he became a Unitarian vicar with his own church in Portsmouth. Gail was completely isolated.
I felt very, very much on my own as I grew up. The family just split off from each other in order to cope with their grief and their shock and trauma.
Tom Sanders tried to see his daughter again, but in 1993, Gail won a court injunction to prevent him from coming near her. She has also won compensation for her mother's death, but it takes no account of the fact that her father was the killer. She has tried to commit suicide several times and remains in constant fear of him.
What do you think of your father now, 12 years on?
I still feel very, very frightened of him. I still have a lot of nightmares and get very scared. What's happened that evening is very much alive in my mind as I speak. It's not any easier to cope with now, and I don't expect it ever will be.
The details of that night's event are locked in Gail's mind. She has never been able to tell anyone about the real horror of watching her father kill her mother.
The fact that my mum died is really the worst thing. But what makes it so much more difficult is the fact that she died in an extremely unpleasant manner. I blame myself that I couldn't stop him. I blame myself every day and every night. Why? What did we do wrong? Why did you treat us that way? Why did you do what you did? Why?
Gail Sanders lives with the loss of her mother and with the horror of a killer in the core of her family. Hers may be a special case, but for the thousands of families of those who kill, their pain is magnified because society ignores both their voice and their grief.
My hopes for all my family was, whatever they wanted to do, it was their life, and they would do it.
Dennis Nilsen, Britain's most prolific serial killer. He murdered 15 young men in London in the late 1970s and early 80s. An average of 1,000 people are killed every year, almost 900 of them killed by men. Born at the end of the Second World War, Betty Scott's second child, Dennis, symbolised hope for her and her family. He grew up in Fraserburgh, a fishing port on the northeast coast of Scotland. Betty's memory of him is of a quiet and sensitive son.
When he was a small boy, he was very kind, caring sort of person. He was good at art. He was always first in his class at art. He never fought at school or anything like that. He was never involved in fighting or anything. He was quiet and reserved. Just a normal boy. if when he would be coming home from school, maybe, and it was raining and a little bird had fallen down and hurt itself, he would pick it up and put it in his jacket and carry it home. And he would say, have you a shoebox, Mum, in cotton wool? And he put the bird there and kept it in the bedroom and looked after it. So I used to say to him, I said, no, Dennis, you have to let this go, you see, when it's well. Oh, I know that, Mum. So when it was time, you'd lift the window and let it fly away. Oh, it was sad when the little bird flew away.
When Dennis was 3, his father Olaf left and Betty remarried. She recalls vividly that it was her father Andrew whom Dennis adored.
He was so fond of my dad, his granda, that I can just picture the two of them together. And he was always looking up at his granda and always trying to do what he did with his hands at his back and walk away. And he used to go everywhere with him. I think that's the thing that stands out in my mind more than anything. The love he had for my dad.
Betty moved to nearby Stricken with her second husband and had 4 more children. It was hard work rearing a family of 7, and she worries now about the friction between her first 2 sons, Olaf and Dennis.
The older ones have to take a sort of backseat a bit when you've a lot of little ones to care for. But Dennis used to get on well with the young ones. It was just his oldest brother. They never got on. Nobody had a wrong word to say about him but his own brother.
At 16, Dennis Nilsen cut his ties with Scotland and home. He went to Aldershot to join the Army Cadets and trained to be a chef. Later went to London and joined first the Metropolitan Police and later the Civil Service, working at a job centre. Contact with home was sporadic.
He was away from me. Now, was whiles Dennis would write, and the next time he would stop writing. But I still wrote to him, knowing I wouldn't get an answer. And his brother went to see Dennis. I think he was at Cricklewood, and everything seemed to be normal. And he did say to me, which hurt me really, about my letters had been there unopened. See, but then he was peculiar that way.
I do not believe that in our present state of knowledge that we are able to predict who is likely to kill and who is not, because there's so many different sorts of people who commit murder. And it is very difficult to predict where these people come from. There are a few pointers: the family background, genetic factors, the effects of alcohol or drugs. Some people lose control more quickly than others. Sometimes people have paranoid ideas. But at the moment, we're not really in a position to be able to tell who is likely to become a murderer with any degree of certainty.
Police digging in the garden of a North London house find what they think could be human bones.
I got such a shock when my oldest son phoned me and told me that Dennis was the cause of all this that was going on the TV. I just couldn't believe it. I said, I don't think so, Olaf. He says, yes, it is, Mum. I said, I don't think he could be capable of doing that. But I just had to accept it. And my world just sort of, no. And of course, at the same time as he was telling me, and my house just filled with reporters, they wanted to talk and wanted photographs, and I went upstairs. I wanted to put across the son I knew. That's why I did that. I wanted to let people know he wasn't like that when I knew him.
After he was arrested, Dennis Nilsen confessed immediately to the killings of 15 young men. He had dismembered most of the bodies and buried or burned them in the gardens of his 2 flats.
I was just shocked. I just didn't know what to think. I couldn't think he could have done that, and yet I was told that he'd done it. And I just couldn't take it in. It was terrible seeing the headlines. I tried to avoid reading it because it was so bad. You can't think that your own son could do that. I'll never get to know about what he did it, because I have, when I was writing to him, he's never mentioned it, though I've asked.
Betty was distressed to find out that Dennis attached some blame for his actions on what people had said at his grandfather's funeral some 30 years earlier, when he was a 5-year-old boy.
Nobody actually said he was dead, see, because that's how people, religious people say, oh, but he's gone to a better place. And he'd been listening to this. He says he always took me everywhere with him. Why could he not have taken me to that better place with him?
Betty could not have known how that confusion about death and going to a better place would come to haunt her son and help to create in him a desire to kill others. It still distresses her.
Now you see, I never knew none of that. That's how he felt. I was real sad that I didn't know that was how he felt.
It's too simplistic to say it's all down to the family. There is more to these cases than just the family. In some circumstances, of course, the family background is important. And in some instances, it has probably no role to play. But in the majority of cases, I believe that family cannot be blamed for the murder that took place by their son or their daughter.
Murder in cold blood. Dennis Nilsen gets life.
Dennis Nilsen had pleaded guilty but insane at his trial. The jury decided that he was sane and guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to serve a minimum of 25 years.
I was angry, but I was more hurt that he'd done all these things to these people. And I was the person that always solved the problems in my family, and I could never make that right. Because you can't. I feel most for the people that he's killed, because it's terrible to do something like that. They're on my mind all the time. And I just hope that they've got somebody, that the Lord's taken care of them the same way as he's done for me, because he's the one that's taken me through all this.
People at home will be watching, wondering how you could have a son that would do this.
Well, it was nothing I'd done. He was just brought up the same as the others. Whether it was because he had gone in the army or gone away to London or what, I don't know. Because there's nobody makes them do things.
The townspeople of Fraserburgh have always supported Betty, but in the privacy of her own home 16 years later, she bears her grief for her son and his victims alone.
I suppose a lot of people maybe thought it was funny, me still loving my son. But it's not funny when it's your own. You just can't forget they've been there. Just push them, sweep them under the carpet and forget they're there. They're always the same person to you. He's always there with me. Days I'll wake up and start thinking about him. I'll never forget him. I never say anything to anybody about it, but it's when I'm on my own that I think of all these things, and it hurts. I suppose I never talk to people about it, and I just carry on from day to day just as if everything was okay. It's always there. I suppose people don't want to know that sort of thing. They don't want to know how you feel, I don't suppose.
It may be easy to understand why Betty's story goes unheard. Serial killers leave so many victims behind. But when a truly horrific case is played out in full public glare, the voice of the killer's family is even more likely to be drowned out.
That day was one of the worst days of my life.
Peter Sutcliffe killed 13 women in a 5-year period between 1975 and 1980. There have been more than 40 serial killers in the UK this century, each of whom killed more than 3 people. By 1980, the whole of Britain was caught in the grip of the Yorkshire Ripper story. Unlike Dennis Nilsen's private killings, there was a climate of fear in the towns of Yorkshire as the mutilated bodies of women grew in number. His sudden arrest in January 1981 was a welcome relief to both the police and the public.
I got to work that morning. I was on the early shift, 6 o'clock till 2. And around about 8 o'clock, the day workers started coming in, bringing the newspapers with them. And one of the lads in the office said to me, he says, "Have you got a brother called Peter?" I said, "No." I said, "I've got a son called Peter."
John Sutcliffe found it hard to match this terrible news with ordinary memories of his son.
Peter was very, very introverted as a child. Very much of a loner. Didn't go in for playing out with other kids. He didn't stay out 5 minutes and he'd be back again. Well, from about 7 years onwards, when Pete was able to read and write, he liked particularly to read. Where the children used to spend the money on sweets, he used to go and buy the comics. He read all the comics that were going at the time. We always had the Beano and the Dandy, I know, because I used to read them after he'd done with them.
And John recalls, too, that as a little boy, Peter was especially close to his mother.
Peter had a very loving relationship with his mother. Always. He'd go anywhere at all with his mother. Hand in hand, mostly. If she'd been to the shops and had a shopping bag in her hand, he'd cling to her skirt all the way home. They were very, very close.
Peter Sutcliffe's life in the middle town of Bingley appeared unremarkable. After school, he worked first at the local cemetery and later for an engineering firm driving lorries all around the country. But in 1975, 1 year after marrying his longtime sweetheart, Sonia Smerza, he murdered the first of his 13 victims.
Did you ever discuss the killings or the Yorkshire Ripper with him?
It's difficult to remember, because at that time, everybody was talking to everybody about it. It was only about 6 months before that he drove me to London and back. We shied away there in the car all the way to London, all the way back again. No, not an inkling of anything being, well, I won't say wrong, but of anything being untoward about his behaviour.
At his tea break at Drummond's Mill in Bradford, on the morning Peter was to be charged, John found out that he was the Yorkshire Ripper's father.
They opened out this newspaper. Not only was the full story with his name and address and even a picture of his house where he lived. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. I had to go to the manager's office and ask him if he'd mind if I went home. because I wouldn't have been any good at work, state I was in then. You think to yourself, you know, it could be wrong. But there was something about the way it was reported and everything that was very convincing.
Peter William Sutcliffe arrives at Dewsbury Magistrates Court to face a charge of murder.
In the early days, I could cry myself to sleep every night for weeks and weeks.
As he was bustled across the pavement into a waiting police van, the volume of abuse from the crowd rose to a deafening pitch.
Well, if somebody had hit me on the head with a sledgehammer, it couldn't have been any more blunt or painful than what it was. Something you can't explain, love. No good, you can't explain the feeling that you get when something like that hits you.
It can be very difficult to cope with the outside world when you have a murderer in your family. They have to be able to face the public. They have to be able to face the neighbors. And they have to be able to face perhaps a criticism and a lot of hostility from the public.
Why didn't you go to the trial?
I'm not one of the morbid types who would sit knitted under the guillotine. So I didn't wish to be there, really.
Have you ever asked Peter why he did what he did?
No. I never asked Peter why he did what he did. I can only say that I wouldn't like to know.
John did not want to reawaken the horror for the families of his son's victims either. He believes no words would be appropriate for them.
There isn't anything you can say. For God's sake, what can you say? I never tried to contact any of the victims' families. It would have been a very wrong thing to do. If I'd have written to them, opened the letter and thought, what the hell does he want with me? What's he trying to do?
Mrs. Sutcliffe died before her son was arrested. The rest of the family has never been able to cope with Peter's crimes and the horror it brought them, and so many others.
We've hardly been a family since. They've all gone their own ways and avoided one another and kept themselves to themselves, and they've been and done their own thing and forgotten to involve themselves in what Peter was and what Peter is.
But John has not forgotten his son. His poor health prevents him going to Broadmoor to see Peter, but they're still in touch.
How would you describe your relationship with Peter now?
As far as I'm concerned, I've got a son who's dead, who rings me up every couple of weeks to see how I'm going on, let me know how he's going on. We chat away on the phone for a quarter of an hour or so. That's the only relationship I've got.
Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, is guilty of murder.
In May 1981, Peter Sutcliffe's plea of schizophrenia failed to convince the jury who found him guilty of murder. His sentence was life in prison.
He should have been hanged. I'm in favour of hanging. I always have been. And no reason to change my outlook on it. I'm not going to say that I would have been happy if he'd been hanged. But if he committed one of those murders, he deserved to be hanged. I love that lad. I don't love him for what he's done. I love him for being who he is. And I always will.
The great majority of those who kill never kill again. They leave a legacy worth only moments on our screens and in our newspapers, but worth a lifetime for all their victims.
It was a blessing to have a boy, to have a son.
Raymond Ellis murdered a 22-year-old woman that he knew in June 1997. Almost 2/3 of victims are known to their killers. Phil Ellis has 3 children. Her youngest, Ray, was born in 1976. They grew up in Weston-super-Mare, where Phil worked teaching children with special needs. Phil can recall the good and bad times as her family grew up.
Ray loved going to the park, loved going on the beach. I can picture him even playing in the garden with her, in the boiling sun with welly boots and a hat on. Going down the garden, waiting for the fox to arrive, teasing his sister with spiders, the love of his cat.
Although Phil knows there is no single answer to why her son committed murder, she wonders what impact Ray's relationship with his father had on him.
Dad to them was a person that went to work, came in, went out. He wasn't a dad in the sense that so many dads are real dads, to the point that Ray, I can think of a particular friend, Dad was sparring on the floor with his own lad. And when we came home, Ray said to me, "I wish I'd got a real dad."
Or was it watching his mother constantly struggle to make ends meet when Ray's father left them?
I know what it's like to not answer the door to the milkman because you've got to pay the bill and you can't pay the bill. And I know what it's like to tell the children to be quiet because there's someone at the door.
So Phil was especially proud of Ray when he managed to win a scholarship to the £12,000 a year public school Colston College in Bristol. But Phil recalls that the family problems went with him.
When he was at Colston, he learned to play the trombone, and he didn't think that he'd be able to have one of his own. But I took him to the market, and there on the floor was this case, very old. We opened it up, and there inside was this trombone. And he said, "But we can't afford it." And I said, "You just hold it, pick it up, hold it."
And I managed to get it for him. And that meant a lot to him. Dad had agreed that he would pay for them to do their music at school. And Dad didn't do that. And I tried to keep it going, but eventually it had to go.
In 1994, Ray went to Nen University College in Northampton. In his second year, he made a decision to leave college. He took odd jobs around the town, lived in bedsits, and was out of regular touch with his family.
He decided on his own. And then he got little jobs. And at that moment in time, he was packing chickens, frozen chickens, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning. And on that dreadful Friday, that's what he'd been doing.
Flowers marked the patch of earth where the body of a young woman was found on Saturday afternoon at the racecourse park in Northampton. More than 70 police officers are now working on this murder investigation.
6 days after the discovery of the body, the phone rang in the family home at Weston. Ray's sister took the call and rang Phil, who was out visiting.
Ray's sister phoned me, and she was screaming down the phone at me that Ray had been arrested for murder. And somehow or other, I don't know now, to this day I don't know, but I do know it whizzed through my head. Thank goodness there's no capital punishment. Poor child. Terribly distressed. Still screaming at me. Me somehow trying to tell her to be quiet. But you just couldn't believe it. You couldn't believe it. And yet it was happening.
It was the beginning of a nightmare journey for Phil.
Ray's big sister went to see Ray first, and then she came home and collected me and took me to see him on the Monday, I think it was. It's hard to remember the day of the week even. Days blended into the next day, nights didn't exist. You didn't want time to exist even, because you couldn't believe it. I just wanted to shut the whole world out. She took me to see him, and I just wanted to get hold of him. And I couldn't. And he'd been told that if he moved, they would jump on him. So he had to sit rigid, not move at all. And I said, I will write to you every day. And I did for a year. I wanted to hug him, and I wanted to feel his arm round me. And all that was taken away. Not just from Ray, but from me, because I'm his mother.
Like so many others, Phil Ellis finds it hard to cope and to find someone to help her. She has turned to the charity Aftermath, which supports and counsels families of serious offenders.
Aftermath sees the families of the offender as being victims in their own right. They feel, I guess, for some of them, rejected by having been to other organisations like Victim Support, who quite clearly state, you know, you're not within our remit, and that's as much as they can do. So when they're contacting Aftermath, they feel, I guess, that it's like a last-ditch effort.
Raymond Ellis was on remand for 1 year at Milton Keynes prison. He had told his mother he did not want her to come to the trial. He pleaded guilty to the murder of 22-year-old Ryan McEwen King and was sent to the high-security prison at Durham last summer.
I can't put myself in that mother's place. And there's a chunk of me that doesn't want to put myself in her shoes. I don't want to feel her grief. I can't cope with mine. But that doesn't mean to say that I don't appreciate her pain, her suffering, Dad's pain, Dad's suffering. Brothers, sisters, family, friends. I can't read the papers now, still, over that incident. All the different things that he was called.
In many families, they have to cope with the fact that people outside are going to label them as a murderous family. They may be stigmatized, they may be ignored, and that's something that may be very difficult for them to cope with, but something they have to adjust to.
They've put a label on him, a killer, someone you don't want to know. Are they ever going to take a label off him?
Well, in my view, the family is serving the same sentence as the offender is. And I don't believe it's right. If they were treated with a bit more dignity, a bit more respect, and there was some understanding that the family are not to blame, then it would be a little easier for the family to cope with their current trauma and situation.
For Phil, life has changed forever. She is constantly reminded of her son's crime.
Just shopping in the supermarket locally, I met a parent of a young person. It's a long time since we've seen each other. How's the family? How's your son? And I was saying, you don't know? You can't know, because you wouldn't have said that to me if you'd known. I've known her a long time. And I had to tell her, in the middle of the supermarket, what had happened. I was in tears in the supermarket. Everybody was looking at me, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't pull myself back together again. And she said to me, but he was such a nice lad, such a kind lad, such a gentle lad. He was all those things. And it was that word "was." And I said to her, he's still those things to me.
Phil would visit her son every week, but Durham is a 6-hour drive from Weston-super-Mare, so visits are rare and precious for her.
Looking forward to seeing my lad. I'm going to try and make him smile, make him relax. That's the hardest thing to do, first of all. I bought 3 shirts for him today, 3 warm shirts, because it's very cold here. And he doesn't normally feel the cold, but he does here.
At his trial last year, Raymond Ellis was sentenced to life. He has yet to be told how many years he will serve.
A lot of people watching this would say, how can you love someone who has killed somebody else?
If he was responsible for that, I don't understand how it happened. The person that I know, I don't understand how it happened. But I do know that if that happened with Ray, something horrendous went wrong. If he made the wrong choice, he needs help. He needs help. And he still needs his mum, and to know that his mother is there. And I am still there for him.
For information on how to get further help and support, call the BBC helpline 0800 88 8809, open for the next 2 hours, or consult CFAX page 621.